On the night of December 8th, 1977, a woman named Nancy Fox sat alone inside her Wichita home. The 25-year-old had spent the evening going about her normal routine, unaware that someone had been watching her. Somewhere in the darkness, a predator was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Nancy Fox would be dead. Hours later, a calm voice called emergency dispatchers and delivered a chilling message. You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
Dispatcher? Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
The caller hung up before anyone could stop him. For investigators, the message confirmed their worst fears. The killer who had terrorized Wichita was still out there. He was becoming more confident, more organized, and more brazen with every crime. He wasn't just murdering people anymore. He was inserting himself into the investigation, forcing law enforcement and the public to pay attention. The man responsible lived an ordinary life. He held jobs. He paid bills. He attended church. He smiled at neighbors and blended into the community around him. And while Wichita searched for a monster, the monster was standing right beside them. This is BTK, the killer next door. Welcome back to Postmortem. This is part 2 of our 3-part series on Dennis Rader, the serial killer known as BTK. In our last episode, we examined Rader's childhood, the violent fantasies that shaped his thinking, and the horrific murders of the Otero family that introduced Wichita to a new kind of predator. We also saw the birth of the name BTK, bind, torture, kill, a title Rader created for himself in an effort to gain the recognition he craved. Today we're picking up where we left off. As investigators search desperately for answers, Rader continues to refine his methods, select new victims, and build a life that appears completely normal from the outside. While Wichita lives in fear, Dennis Rader is learning how to hide in plain sight. That contrast is what makes this case so disturbing. The same man who tucked his children into bed at night was capable of unspeakable violence. The same man who would eventually serve in positions of trust within his community was secretly stalking victims and planning murders. Tonight we'll explore the years when BTK became more than a killer. He became a ghost. Someone who would move through everyday life completely unnoticed while continuing to terrorize an entire city. So lock your doors, turn on a light, and settle in. Let's get started. Before we continue, let's briefly revisit where our story left off. In January of 1974, Wichita, Kansas was shaken by a crime so brutal that it would forever change the city. Inside their home, Joseph and Julie Otero, along with 2 of their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were murdered by an unknown intruder. The attack appeared calculated, organized, and deeply personal, despite the fact that the victims had never met the man who killed them. For investigators, the case was unlike anything they had encountered. There was no clear motive, few promising leads, and no obvious suspect. As detectives searched for answers, the killer quietly returned to his everyday life. That killer was Dennis Rader, a seemingly ordinary husband and father who had spent years nurturing violent fantasies centered on control, domination, and murder. What began as a disturbing thought and voyeuristic behavior eventually escalated into real-world violence when fantasy was no longer enough to satisfy him. But the murders themselves weren't enough for Rader. He wanted recognition. He wanted the public to fear him and law enforcement to acknowledge him. Through anonymous letters and communications, he inserted himself into the investigation and ultimately gave himself a name that would become infamous around the world. BTK. Bind, torture, kill. By the end of our last episode, Wichita knew a dangerous predator was operating within the city. What they didn't know was that the violence was far from over. Dennis Rader had discovered that killing fulfilled the fantasies he carried for years. And instead of satisfying his urges, it only intensified them. While investigators worked tirelessly to identify the person responsible, BTK was already thinking about his next victim. And over the next several years, he would continue to stalk, hunt, and murder while hiding behind the mask of an ordinary citizen. The killer Wichita feared most wasn't lurking in the shadows on the edge of town. He was living among them. As the investigation into the Otero murder stalled, Fear began spreading throughout Wichita. Residents locked their doors, watched unfamiliar cars more closely, and wondered when, or if, the killer would strike again. Unfortunately, they wouldn't have to wait long. Just 3 months after the Otero murders, BTK would attack again, and this time, someone would survive to tell the story. In the months following the Otero family murders, Wichita was a city struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. The murders had dominated local headlines, and residents found themselves asking the same troubling question. If an entire family could be attacked and killed inside their own home, who was truly safe? The sense of security that many families had taken for granted was beginning to disappear. Parents became more cautious, neighbors paid closer attention to unfamiliar vehicles, and conversations that once centered on everyday life increasingly turned toward fear and uncertainty. For law enforcement, the pressure was immense. Detectives worked around the clock pursuing leads, conducting interviews, and processing evidence, but the investigation yielded few answers. The killer had left behind a crime scene that suggested planning and organization, yet there was little physical evidence capable of identifying a suspect. In the 1970s, many of the forensic tools that investigators rely on today simply did not exist. DNA profiling was still years away, and detectives often had to depend on witness statements, physical evidence, and traditional investigative techniques. Despite their efforts, the person responsible for the Otero murders remained unknown. As weeks turned into months, many residents hoped the attack had been an isolated event. Some believed the killer may have left the area. Others convinced themselves that the murder stemmed from a personal dispute that would never affect anyone else. It was an understandable attempt to regain a sense of normalcy. The alternative, that a serial killer was living somewhere within their community, was also too frightening to consider. But while Wichita tried to heal, Dennis Rader was becoming more confident. The success of the Otero murders had reinforced everything he believed about himself. He had carried out his fantasies, avoided capture, and watched as an entire city searched unsuccessfully for answers. Rather than frightening him, the investigation emboldened him. Each day that passed without an arrest strengthened his belief that he was smarter than the people trying to catch him. The fear spreading through Wichita wasn't something he regretted. It was something he enjoyed. One of the most disturbing parts of the BTK case is how ordinary Rader's life appeared during this time. While the city worried about an unknown killer, he continued moving through society unnoticed. Friends, coworkers, and acquaintances had no reason to suspect that the man they interacted with was responsible for one of the most notorious crimes in Wichita's history. The disconnect between his public image and his private reality would become one of the most defining features of this case. But then, just 3 months after the murders of the Otero family, BTK struck again. On April 4th, 1974, 19-year-old Catherine Bright and her 21-year-old brother Kevin Bright were inside their Wichita home when an intruder entered. Unlike the Otero family, however, this attack would not go exactly as Dennis Rader had planned. For the first time, he would encounter resistance that threatened to derail his carefully constructed fantasy. And for the first time, one of his intended victims would survive. The attack on Catherine and Kevin Bright would reveal important details about BTK's methods, expose weaknesses in his planning, and provide investigators with a living witness. But it would also demonstrate something equally troubling. Dennis Rader was learning from every crime he committed, and with each attack, he was becoming more dangerous. The attack on Catherine and Kevin Bright was much like the Oteros. They had no connection to Rader. They were not chosen because of anything they had done. They simply crossed paths with the fantasies and obsessions of a man searching for victims. Rader had spent time watching the home and believed he understood the routines of the people who lived there. As he had done before, he approached the situation with a plan. But BTK's plans were often built on assumptions, and assumptions can be dangerous. On the afternoon of April 4th, he entered the Bright residence expecting to find Catherine alone. Instead, he encountered both Catherine and Kevin, immediately creating complications that threatened his control of the situation. When Kevin arrived home, he was confronted by an armed intruder. Rader attempted to gain compliance by using the same tactic he had employed during the Otero murders, claiming he was a wanted criminal who needed money and transportation. The story was intended to calm the victims long enough for him to establish control. But unlike the Otero attack, events quickly became chaotic. As Rader attempted to restrain the siblings, a violent struggle erupted. Kevin fought back aggressively, refusing to submit to the attack. The confrontation disrupted the carefully controlled fantasy Rader had envisioned. For a man obsessed with dominance and authority, resistance was something he neither expected nor tolerated. The struggle escalated as Rader attempted to regain control of the situation. During the attack, Kevin was shot multiple times, but despite his injuries, he continued fighting and would later credit instinct and determination for helping him survive. The chaos inside the home was unlike the methodical control Rader preferred. This was not the carefully orchestrated scenario he had imagined. It was messy, unpredictable, and dangerous. Amid the struggle, Catherine suffered devastating injuries. Despite efforts to survive the attack, she was ultimately murdered by Rader. At just 19 years old, her life was taken by a man she had never met, a victim selected solely because she happened to fit the fantasy of a serial killer seeking control and gratification. What happened next would become one of the most significant moments in the early BTK investigation. Kevin Bright survived. For investigators, a living witness offered something they had not had after the Otero murders. Kevin was able to provide information about the attacker, his behavior, his mannerisms, and the events that unfolded inside the home. While his description would not immediately identify Dennis Rader, it provided valuable insight into the person detectives were hunting. The attack also revealed something important about BTK himself. Despite the image he would later cultivate as calculating criminal mastermind, Dennis Rader was far from perfect. The Bright attack exposed flaws in his planning and demonstrated that his crimes could quickly unravel when victims resisted. He was not an unstoppable predator. He was a man desperately trying to force reality to match the fantasies he had rehearsed in his mind for years. For Rader, the lessons he took away from the attack were not the same lessons investigators hoped to learn. Rather than being discouraged by the mistakes he made, he analyzed them. He studied what he got wrong. He thought about how he could avoid similar problems in the future. In many ways, the Bright attack became a learning experience for him, one that would help shape the methods he used in later crimes. Meanwhile, Wichita's worst fears were confirmed. The Otero murders had not been an isolated tragedy. The city was facing a serial offender who was willing to strike again and again. The realization sent a wave of fear through the community and intensified pressure on law enforcement to identify the killer before another family was destroyed. Unfortunately, BTK was only getting started. Over the next several years, Dennis Rader would refine his approach, become more patient, and grow increasingly confident in his ability to evade capture. As his double life continued to develop, he would learn how to hide behind the appearance of an ordinary citizen while secretly stalking future victims. And with each successful crime, the gap between Dennis Rader, the family man, and BTK, the serial killer, would grow even wider. The attack on Catherine and Kevin Bright taught Dennis Rader something he would carry with him for the rest of his criminal career. Control could never be assumed. The struggle inside the Bright home had disrupted his plans, left behind a surviving witness, and forced him into a level of chaos he despised. For a man whose fantasies revolved around complete domination, the experience was frustrating, but instead of deterring him, it became a lesson. Rader began analyzing his mistakes and thinking about how to eliminate uncertainty in future attacks. Over the next several years, he became more patient. Rather than acting impulsively, he spent increasing amounts of time studying potential victims and their daily routines. He watched homes from a distance, noted work schedules, and observed who came and went, and looked for moments when someone might be isolated and vulnerable. The stalking itself became part of the ritual. Long before he entered a victim's home, he often felt a sense of gratification simply from watching and planning. Rader referred to many of these targets as projects. The term was chilling because it stripped away their humanity. In his mind, victims became objects to be studied, evaluated, and eventually acted upon. Some projects never progressed beyond surveillance. Others became obsessions that lasted for months. The process gave him a sense of power long before any crime was committed. As his confidence grew, so did his ability to compartmentalize his life. By day, he continued presenting himself as an ordinary citizen. He maintained relationships, held jobs, and participated in everyday activities. The people around him saw a husband, father, a coworker. They did not see the notebooks of fantasies, the hours spent stalking strangers, or the dark inner world he carefully concealed. This ability to separate his public and private identities became one of his greatest advantages. Investigators faced a frustrating challenge. They knew they were dealing with a dangerous offender, but there were few clear patterns connecting the crimes. BTK did not target a specific age group, occupation, or neighborhood. His victims varied, making it difficult to predict who might be next. The lack of a consistent victim profile complicated efforts. They couldn't narrow the suspect pool, and that increased the fear spreading throughout Wichita. For Rader, the passage of time was not a problem. Unlike many criminals driven by immediate gratification, he was capable of waiting. Weeks, months, and sometimes years could pass between attacks. During those periods, he immersed himself in fantasy, revisited memories of previous crimes, and continued searching for future victims. The cooling off periods created the illusion that the threat had disappeared, but in reality, BTK was never inactive. He was always watching, always planning, and always feeding the obsession that drove him. This evolution made him more dangerous. The impulsive mistakes seen during the Bright attack became less common as he gained experience. He learned how to approach victims more effectively, how to manipulate situations to his advantage, and how to leave behind fewer opportunities for investigators. Each crime became part of a disturbing education, allowing him to refine the methods that would define his reign of terror. While Rader was improving as a predator, something else was developing alongside his criminal behavior. He was building a family, pursuing a career, and constructing the image of a respectable member of the community. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. The same man who spent his free time stalking victims was also attending family gatherings and participating in everyday life. That double life would become one of the most unsettling parts of the BTK case, because as Dennis Rader continued to hunt, he was also becoming exactly the kind of person no one would suspect. And while Wichita searched for a monster, the monster was quietly building a life right in the middle of the community. The next chapter of this story isn't just about murder. It's about deception, because BTK was learning how to hide in plain sight. As the years passed, Dennis Rader became increasingly skilled at balancing two identities that could not have been more different. On one side was the man his family, friends, and neighbors believed they knew. He was married to Paula Rader, raising children and working regular jobs, and participating in community life. To those around him, he appeared dependable, responsible, unremarkable. There was nothing about his outward appearance that suggested he was one of the most dangerous men in Kansas. This contrast is one of the reasons the BTK case continues to fascinate and disturb people decades later. Many serial killers create some degree of separation between themselves and society, but Rader immersed himself in it. He wasn't living on the fringes. He wasn't isolated from the community. He was actively involved in the very environments that made people feel safe. He attended church, interacted with neighbors, and built a reputation as an ordinary family man. Behind that carefully maintained image, the fantasies never stopped. Even during periods when he wasn't actively killing, Rader remained deeply consumed by the desires that had fueled his crime from the beginning. He spent time stalking potential victims, replaying previous murders in his mind, and documenting aspects of his fantasy life through writings and photographs. The public saw stability. Privately, he was nurturing the same obsessions that had led to the murders of the Otero family and Catherine Bright. One of the most unsettling realities of the BTK case is that there was often no obvious transition between the two worlds. Rader could spend time with his family, attend a social event, or go to work, then later engage in behaviors connected to his fantasies. The ability to compartmentalize allowed him to keep suspicion at bay. The people closest to him were seeing only one side of the man. The other side remained hidden behind a mask he had spent years perfecting. For investigators, this presented a major obstacle. Many people imagine serial killers as individuals who stand out because of dangerous behavior or obvious warning signs. In reality, some offenders are able to blend into society remarkably well. Dennis Rader understood how to appear normal. He understood how to say the right things, fulfill expected roles, and avoid drawing attention to himself. That normalcy became one of his most effective tools. As BTK's confidence continued to grow, so did his belief in his own superiority. Every year he avoided capture reinforced the idea that he was smarter than law enforcement. He watched investigations unfold from a distance, knowing that detectives were searching for someone who could be standing beside them in a grocery store, sitting a few pews away in church, or living just down the street. The fact that no one suspected him became part of the thrill. But while Dennis Rader was becoming increasingly comfortable in his double life, the urge to kill never truly disappeared. The fantasies that had driven him since childhood continued demanding attention, and eventually they pushed him toward new victims. The periods of silence between attacks created the illustration that BTK had vanished, but that illustration would not last forever. In 1977, after years of relative quiet, BTK would return in a devastating way. The murders of Shirley Vianne and Nancy Fox would demonstrate just how confident and dangerous he had become. More importantly, they would reveal a killer who was no longer satisfied with simply taking lives. He wanted to be known, feared, and remembered. And that growing need for attention would soon become just as dangerous as the murders themselves. By 1977, nearly 3 years had passed since the attack on Catherine and Kevin Bright. To many residents of Wichita, it may have seemed as though BTK had disappeared. The long periods between attacks created uncertainty. Some people wondered whether the killer had left the area, been incarcerated for another crime, or perhaps even died. But while the public waited for answers, Dennis Rader was still there, living his double life and feeding the fantasies that had never gone away. On March 17, 1977, BTK struck again. 24-year-old Shirley Vianne was at home with her children when Rader forced his way into the residence. Like many of his victims, Shirley had never met him. There was no personal connection, no argument, and no warning. She was targeted because she fit the role Rader had imagined in his fantasies. After entering the home, Rader quickly established control over the situation. He separated Shirley from her children and confined the young children to a bathroom while carrying out the attack. The details of what happened next are difficult to comprehend. While the children remained inside the home, unaware of the full horror unfolding around them, Rader murdered their mother. It was another example of the cold, calculated nature of his crimes and his complete disregard for the devastation he left behind. The murder of Shirley Vianne sent another wave of fear through Wichita. Investigators now had additional evidence that the Otero murders and the Bride attack were not isolated incidents. They were dealing with a serial offender who continued to evade capture despite years of investigation. Every new crime increased public pressure on law enforcement and intensified concerns that another attack could happen at any time. Less than 9 months later, BTK claimed another victim. On the evening of December 8, 1977, 25-year-old Nancy Fox was alone in her home after finishing work. Nancy was known as a hardworking and independent young woman who enjoyed spending time with friends and family. Like the victims before her, she had no connection to Dennis Rader and no reason to believe she was being watched. At some point that evening, Rader entered her home. He confronted Nancy, restrained her, and ultimately murdered her. The attack followed patterns investigators were beginning to recognize: careful planning, a desire for control, and a victim chosen through stalking rather than personal motive. But what happened after the murder would make the case even more infamous. In the early morning hours following the attack, a call was placed to emergency dispatch, and the caller spoke calmly and directly. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox." The caller then hung up. Authorities quickly realized the call had likely come from the killer himself. The message represented a major escalation. BTK was no longer satisfied with committing murders and remaining hidden. He wanted involvement in the investigation. He wanted detectives, journalists, and the public to know he was responsible. The call wasn't necessary. It served no practical purpose. It existed solely to draw attention to him and reinforce the power he felt over the city. For investigators, the call was both valuable and deeply frustrating. It confirmed aspects of the killer's behavior and demonstrated a growing confidence that bordered on arrogance. BTK believed he could communicate directly with law enforcement and still avoid capture. Unfortunately, at that point in the investigation, he was proving to be correct. The murders of Shirley Vianne and Nancy Fox marked a turning point in the BTK case. The attacks demonstrated that the killer was becoming more organized, more self-assured, and increasingly obsessed with recognition. His desire for attention was no longer secondary to the murders. It was becoming part of the fantasy itself. And as Dennis Rader's ego continued to grow, so does his need to control not only his victims, but also the story being told about him. Before long, he would begin communicating more aggressively with the media and law enforcement, ensuring that the name BTK remained firmly planted in the minds of Wichita residents. The murders terrified the city. The letters would make sure no one forgot who was responsible. One of the most common questions investigators and criminologists have asked about Dennis Rader is simple: how did he choose his victims? Unlike some serial killers who target a very specific type of person, BTK's victims varied in age, occupation, and background. At first glance, there didn't appear to be a clear pattern, but when investigators examined Rader's own statements and writings, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Rader rarely selected victims because of who they were as individuals. In most cases, he knew very little about them personally. Instead, he chose people who fit into the fantasies he had been developing for years. He often became interested in someone after seeing them in a neighborhood, observing them during daily activities, or simply noticing them while driving through Wichita. What started as curiosity could evolve into an obsession. Once someone caught his attention, Rader frequently began what he called a project. This could involve days, weeks, or even months of surveillance. He watched homes from a distance, learned routines, noted work schedules, and looked for opportunities to isolate potential victims. He paid attention to details that might help him gain control during an attack. The stalking phase became an important part of the fantasy, allowing him to imagine scenarios long before he acted on them. One of the most frightening parts of BTK's victim selection process was how ordinary it was. There was often nothing unusual about the people he targeted. They were mothers, daughters, sons, employees, neighbors, and friends. They weren't chosen because they had crossed paths with him, or because they were involved in criminal activity. Many were simply living normal lives when they unknowingly attracted the attention of a predator. Rader's writings reveal that he often viewed victims less as human beings and more as characters in the stories he created in his mind. He became fixated on the idea of controlling every aspect of an encounter, from the initial confrontation to the final outcome. This obsession with control explains why he spent so much time planning and why unexpected resistance, like the struggle with Kevin Bright, frustrated him so deeply. Reality rarely matched the fantasy perfectly, but he continued trying to force the world to conform to the scenarios he had imagined. Another misconception about serial killers is that they are constantly hunting. In reality, Rader often experienced long periods between attacks. During those gaps, he wasn't necessarily inactive. He was fantasizing, observing, and searching for opportunities. The cool-off periods allowed him to blend back into everyday life while continuing to nurture the obsession that drove him. To the outside world, he appeared normal. Internally, he was preparing for future crimes. Investigators eventually realized that predicting BTK's next move was nearly impossible because his victim selection was driven more by fantasy than by practical patterns. He wasn't targeting a single neighborhood, profession, or demographic group. He was selecting people who fit the needs of his imagination at a particular moment in time. That unpredictability made him especially dangerous and contributed to the fear that spread throughout Wichita. As the years passed, Rader became increasingly confident in his ability to identify and stalk victims without detection. Each successful crime reinforced the belief that he was smarter than law enforcement and more capable than the people trying to stop him. That confidence fed his ego. For Dennis Rader, murder was never just about killing. It was about power, recognition, and control. And while he enjoyed controlling his victims, he was beginning to crave something even bigger. He wanted to control the entire conversation. The next phase of the BTK case would be defined not only by violence, but by the increasingly bold communications that transformed an unknown killer into a self-promoting celebrity of his own creation. As his ego expanded, so did his willingness to taunt investigators, manipulate the media, and demand the attention he believed he deserved. By the late 1970s, Dennis Rader had succeeded in something very few serial killers ever achieve. He had murdered multiple victims, evaded capture, and managed to maintain the appearance of an ordinary citizen. Every day he remained free reinforced a belief that was already taking root in his mind. He was smarter than everyone else. Investigators couldn't identify him, the public had no idea who he was, and even the people closest to him remained completely unaware of the life he was living in secret. For Rader, that success became intoxicating. What made BTK different from many other serial offenders was the extent of his need for recognition. The murders themselves were only part of the gratification he sought. He wanted people to know a predator was out there. He wanted fear to spread through Wichita. Most importantly, he wanted credit. In his mind, he wasn't simply committing crimes. He was creating a legacy. He saw himself as the central character in a story that the public and the media were failing to appreciate. This growing ego became evident through his communications with law enforcement and the press. Rather than remaining silent, Rader repeatedly found ways to insert himself into the investigation. He sent letters, poems, and messages designed to remind people that BTK still existed. These communications often contained details that only the killer could know, ensuring that investigators would take them seriously. But beyond providing information, the letters served another purpose. They fed his need for attention. Reading those communications today is unsettling because they reveal how Rader viewed himself. He often wrote with a sense of self-importance that bordered on theatrical. He wasn't just describing crimes, he was crafting an image. He wanted BTK to become a name people feared, discussed, and remembered. The nickname itself was part of that effort. By giving himself a title, he transformed his crimes into a brand, one that he hoped would live long after the murders. As his confidence grew, so did his willingness to take risks. Contacting the media and law enforcement created opportunities for mistakes, but Rader seemed convinced that he could outsmart anyone trying to catch him. He viewed the communications as a game, one in which he controlled the rules. Each letter that made headlines and each news report that mentioned BTK reinforced the power he felt. He wasn't just stalking victims anymore, he was manipulating an entire city. For Wichita residents, the communications were terrifying. The letter served as a reminder that the killer remained free. Every message reignited public fear and brought fresh attention to crimes that many people desperately wanted to forget. Parents worried about their children. Women altered their routines. And neighbors looked at one another with suspicion. BTK's words extended the impact of his crimes far beyond the immediate victims, creating a psychological presence that lingered even when he wasn't actively killing. For investigators, they faced a difficult balancing act. On one hand, the communications provided insight into the killer's mindset and occasionally offered information that helped advance the investigation. On the other hand, every publicized message gave Rader exactly what he wanted: attention. Law enforcement understood that BTK fed on recognition, but ignoring him entirely wasn't always possible. The letters became both a valuable source of information and a tool the killer used to maintain his notoriety. As the years passed, something unusual happened. The murders slowed, and eventually they appeared to stop altogether. BTK seemed to vanish. There were no new victims, no major communications, and no obvious signs of activity. For a generation of Wichita residents, the fear gradually faded into memory. New investigators entered law enforcement, new cases demanded attention, and life moved on. But Dennis Rader had not disappeared. He was still living in Wichita, still raising a family, and still attending church. Still carrying the fantasies that had driven him for decades. And while the city believed the BTK story might finally be over, the most shocking chapter was still waiting to be written. For years, Dennis Rader managed to balance two completely different lives. One was visible to the world, a husband, father, employee, and trusted member of the community, and the other existed in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and private fantasies. It was a life built on violence, obsession, and relentless desire for control. By the end of the 1970s, BTK had established himself as one of the most feared killers in America. Then almost as suddenly as he had appeared, he seemed to vanish. The murders stopped. The letters became infrequent. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. Had BTK left Wichita? Had he died? Had he been in prison for another crime? Or was he still there, hiding in plain sight? For more than 2 decades, no one knew the answer. But in 2004, after years of silence, BTK would make a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Driven by the same ego that had fueled him from the beginning, he would once again reach out to the media and law enforcement. He wanted attention. He wanted recognition. What he got instead was a one-way ticket to prison. Next time on Postmortem, we'll examine BTK's shocking return, the investigation that finally identified Dennis Rader, and the single mistake that ended one of the longest serial murder cases in American history. For now, head on over to Patreon and take this episode's poll question, and get access to the court documents, the full FBI case file, and BTK's journals, and some of the crime scene photos. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant.